Good evening and welcome to the new BUGAJSKI Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank the Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK in Kosovo. And today I will be discussing some important questions with a major security analyst. Our guest on the BUGAJSKI hot seat is Mike Houtsell, Senior Fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations, Johns Hopkins University, who is a former advisor to Vice President Joe Biden and a key figure in Balkan policy over the past 25 years. But first, my political commentary on an important international topic is entitled Global Oil Bust. The dramatic collapse of oil prices is changing the strategic position of various states. It has buttressed America's role, diminished Russia's position, and fueled the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. During the boom year in 2008, oil prices reached a record $143 per barrel. Oil is currently selling at $33 per barrel, and prices might not reach $50 again until the 2020s. The oil-centered world of the 20th century is collapsing, with serious implications for the biggest oil-exporting countries. Since the breakup of the Soviet Union, Moscow has used oil and natural gas, whose price is closely tied to oil, as a weapon against its former satellites and a form of leverage against the EU. Threats to cut supplies or raise prices enabled the Kremlin to inject itself in the affairs of its neighbors. But the floor is now collapsing under the Kremlin, as it loses its key energy weapon. And in order to balance the budget, Russia needs oil prices to be at $80 a barrel, whereas plunging prices are fueling a prolonged economic downturn, diminishing living standards, and provoking unrest and potential social revolution. Several other states, including Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, and Venezuela, are also experiencing economic and political turmoil as a result of the oil crash. And the longer that prices remain low, the more devastating the consequences. Saudi Arabia's substantial cash reserves have been dramatically depleted, and the government is now reducing public spending. It also has a new regional competitor after Western sanctions were lifted against Iran. Iranian oil production will increase as Tehran returns to the global market. Oil prices rise when the global economy is growing and demand accelerates. They contract when the global economy is stagnant and energy demand is weak. When China, India, and Brazil were booming, the demand for oil increased. But each of these economies is now stagnating, and the demand for their manufactured exports is declining. Many factors are working against a new surge in oil prices, especially as America, the world's biggest importer, has now found alternatives. In addition to rising home production, increased fuel efficiency has reduced the US demand for petroleum, and alternative energies are gaining in prominence. Such trends indicate that global oil demand will undergo long-term decline. This also means that the Middle East will diminish in importance as a security priority for Washington because of lessened dependence on oil supplies. Paradoxically, this could generate further instability in the region as Saudi Arabia and Iran compete for regional predominance with a lessened American deterrent to prevent all-out war. It is time for the BUGAJSKI hot seat with our special guest, Mike Houtsell. Mike is a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University here in Washington, D.C., and he's also a former advisor to Vice President Joe Biden when he served in the Senate. So thank you for joining us, Mike. It's
my pleasure.
Very good to have you here at the VOA studios, and I'm sure our audience in Pristina is going to look forward to everything you have to say today. As I mentioned at the beginning, you've been engaged as a policy advisor and analyst on the Balkans, I think, for over 25 years. Particularly during the wars in the former Yugoslavia, you were very closely engaged. Let me ask you a sort of big picture question. We hear about persistent problems every day, every week, every month in each of these countries, and I'll go through some of these with you. But let's look back a little bit, step back a little bit, and look at the achievements that this region has made, particularly, I would say, since the days of Milosevic, since the late 90s. Could you sort of outline for us where the Balkans now stand as compared to where they did stand?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, clearly, in spite of all the problems today, the region is in much better shape than it was 25 years ago. I mean, there are no wars, nobody's fighting each other, there's no genocide going on, there are no massacres. There is not the kind of uncertainty that there was with the collapse of Yugoslavia. No one was sure exactly what would result. There are some uncertainties, but nothing to compare with that. And it's difficult to, in words, just in a few sentences, to sum up how terrible things were 25 years ago. I mean, it was just awful. I would go to the region regularly, every few weeks, and it was explosive, and it was dangerous, and it was terrible. And I saw massacre sites, and I could go into grisly detail if you'd like about. Wow. Once, just after the war had ended in Bosnia, I was taken to a just discovered site in the far north of Bosnia, Crni Vrh, I think it was called, I can't remember. 640 some bodies, skeletons uncovered. They were all women and children, all Bosniak women and children that had been murdered. And in the spring of '92, and then exhumed after Dayton and transferred to this place, presumably because it was a little more out of the way, but some people felt it was just a way to, a shot across the bow of the Bosniaks that this could happen again. Anyway, it was terrible. I mean, just simply terrible. Today, what do we have? Is it paradise? No, certainly not paradise. Let's start with the big successes. I mean, Croatia and Slovenia in the north are both members of NATO and the EU. That's the good housekeeping seal of approval for our listeners who know the American idiom. They are members now of the Euro-Atlantic community. NATO means that their borders are guaranteed. The EU means that there's just a whole package of, the acquis is over 100,000 pages long now, but basically it guarantees a certain level of human rights, social rights, economic assistance when necessary. And yes, the EU is having problems, and we can discuss that later if you'd like, but the fact is it's a gigantic achievement to be a member. Serbia, arguably the most central country in a metaphoric way of the Western Balkans, I would submit is on a positive trajectory for the first time in many years. Prime Minister Vučić is a man who is clearly trying to balance carefully between Serbia's historical orientation towards Russia and what is, it seems to me, obviously the only viable future for Serbia, namely to become a member of certainly the EU and maybe someday even NATO. And he's balancing and so far doing it pretty well. There'll be new elections, but it strikes me that he's a pragmatist. In the Balkans, I think it's nice for historians to look into politicians' earlier careers, but honestly, in the last analysis, what matters is how they've learned from experience. And what I'm trying to say is there are a lot of people in many countries who have ultra-nationalist backgrounds, some of them rather unsavory, some of them are unreconstructed nationalists, but many have learned. And I would put Mr. Vučić in certainly in the latter category. Montenegro. There's a country that I think, well, I mean, it's a new country. It wasn't until 2006 that it got its complete independence. I don't think very many people would have thought even then that it would be at the end of 2015 invited by NATO to enter final status negotiations. That's a gigantic achievement. Montenegro still has problems, But the fact is, it has moved forward in a way that is, I would say, almost spectacular. Bosnia, ongoing problems. I have to say, I find Bosnia a disappointment. It's a country with terrible history in the last 20 years. I mean, the population is way down from what it was pre-war. We all know about the well over 100,000 people killed during the war, many driven into exile. My country, the United States of America, has profited greatly from that, as we always do. The Bosnian immigrants to the United States, on the whole, have been hugely successful. I read the other day where
St. Louis, I think,
St. Louis is a big center, but I read the other day where, in connection with the Iowa caucuses, which occurred last night, I read that Iowa is now getting its first foreign consulate of Bosnia and Herzegovina. That's remarkable, really. I could go into personal things about how my late mother-in-law, who just died at just short of 102 years old, was cared for in Iowa, old folks home, by many nurses from abroad, but the biggest single group came from Bosnia and Herzegovina. So anyway, Bosnia still has problems, and I hope that constitutional reform can proceed. It's necessary. Milorad Dodik, the leader of the Republika Srpska, still has dreams, and I think they're just that, dreams of secession referenda. It's a real problem. I'm very frustrated with Bosnia because there's an amazing amount of talent there. Albania. Albania is in NATO, which is certainly a big achievement. I think it still suffers from a lot of clan-like politics, corruption. Kosovo, one can say the same thing, except there in Kosovo, there's a what I would consider to be a populist right-wing group, Vetvendosia, that again has some talented people. I know the leaders who want to nullify portions of the agreement between Serbia and Kosovo, who don't want to see the autonomy for the ethnic Serb majority districts in the north go into effect, and who I think basically have wild-eyed dreams of a greater Albania, which is not going to happen. Totally unrealistic. I mentioned corruption. I looked the other day at the newest Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. I actually have them in my pocket, but I won't pull them out except to say there's corruption all over the world, and you know, the best performing places are Denmark, just slightly ahead of Finland. The worst are Somalia and North Korea. 168 countries were rated, and everything in between. Slovenia was the highest performing in the Balkans. It came in just in the top 1/4. So not bad. Croatia came in just into the top 1/3. Most of the others were in the middle, which is not terribly good if you consider all the underdeveloped parts of the world. And I regret to say that Albania, and even more so Kosovo, wound up in the bottom half, which is kind of shocking. There's always room for improvement. The United States was only 16th, so you know, who knows?
Well, we can go into a little bit more detail on Kosovo, but still looking at the bigger picture. In recent months, we have had unrest obviously in Macedonia over these scandals, the taping scandals. We've had unrest in Kosovo over disagreement, as you mentioned, between Pristina and Belgrade, which Vetvendosia objects to, as well as a couple of other opposition parties. And also in Montenegro, we've had protests against what you mentioned, official corruption, evident official corruption. Is there a link here that you see? Is there, in other words, is there growing social unrest and dissatisfaction with the ruling elites, would you say, in some of these countries?
I think there's always dissatisfaction with the ruling elites, and especially in democracies that are maybe not as participatory as they might be and as open as they might be. Are there links? Unless things have changed greatly, I think one can say that there are organized crime links, unfortunately. But I think you're right, there is dissatisfaction, but this is not just a Balkan problem. And it's not just a European problem. It's a global problem. There's dissatisfaction in the United States. Look at the candidacies of Donald Trump and Ted Cruz and people like that who want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
We'll come back to American politics near the end, but yeah.
But what I want to say about the Balkans is, I think, in a way, and not for for positive reasons, for negative reasons, the Balkans have become more and more like the rest of Europe. The migration crisis, for example. I mean, everybody knows this is ripping Balkan society apart. You probably want to talk about Macedonia in this regard. The Euro crisis. I mean, it's all about Greece. People are talking about talking about a Brexit too. But certainly talking about a Grexit. The newest is that the EU is threatening, EU Commission threatening to exclude Greece from the Schengen area. So if anybody ever thought that the Balkans are far away and we can wall them off and let them do their thing, they're not like us. When you used to hear this in Western Europe, that's just not the case anymore. I mean, it's completely tied into Europe.
So this public frustration, the immigration, actually what we saw last year was a large percentage of those that were coming to Germany and Austria were actually from Kosovo, from Macedonia, from Albania, from other Balkan countries. But you don't think this threatens to reverse the democratization process thus far in the region? In other words, public unrest can be handled, do you think, within the system?
I think it can, and I think you've seen in just about every country in the Balkans peaceful transfer of power after elections, which is the bottom line for democracies. It would probably help if more of the people in official positions who are reputed to be corrupt were either proven to be incorruptible or indicted, one or the other. But I mean, hanging out there, letting the rumor mill on the street go wild in an area that certainly is not lacking in creativity in terms of conspiracy theories is a bad thing. But it's not easy to get people before courts. I mean, in our country, the most notorious criminal in American history, Al Capone, was finally convicted because of income tax evasion. So, I mean, it's not easy. But I think let the processes work. I don't anticipate any kind of attempts at overthrow of any of the governments or rolling back democracy. I mean, you mentioned Montenegro. Sure, there were protests, but then right after the protests, the parliament voted, and the parliament gave a resounding vote of confidence to the government in a slightly different alignment as before. But so that I think might become the rule.
Turning now specifically to Kosovo, you mentioned Vetëvendosja as one of the opposition groups in Kosovo that staged protests, particularly against this agreement on creation of a Serb Municipalities Association, the Zajednica, in Kosovo. Not so much, my first question actually is, what do you see, how do you see the role of Vetëvendosja? In other words, disrupting parliament, throwing tear gas in parliament, extra parliamentary protests and so forth. What is within the bounds of democratic behavior, would you say?
Well, certainly throwing stink bombs in parliament is not inside the bounds of democratic behavior. I think any kind of violence is just simply unacceptable. And I haven't been to Kosovo now for maybe 2 years. When I was there on one of my trips fairly recently, I spent an entire long evening with Albin Kurti and Shpend Ahmeti and very talented gentlemen. The kind of people that you would hope would contribute to building new democracies anywhere in the world, in this case in a new country, in Kosovo. And we discussed, we didn't agree on a lot of things. I made they went into great detail about corruption. I have no way of knowing if their assertions were true or false. As I said, I don't depend on the Balkan rumor mill. I want proof. But I think when they would talk about allegedly traitorous activities of politicians because they came to an agreement with Serbia, there I think I could disagree, because I feel that politics, whether domestic or international, is the art of the possible. And I think the agreement that was hammered out between Serbia and Kosovo is just that. Both sides had to compromise. You can't get everything. It's not going to work. But I think that if you look at where things were when Kosovo declared independence and where they are now, internationally, recognized by 111 countries, relations with Belgrade, they're not perfect. There's no recognition. They're still being kept out of international bodies. Nonetheless, I would submit that Kosovo is in better shape internationally than anybody had any right to think they would be a few years after independence. Now, domestically, I already said they're way down. Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, that's not good. Economic development could be much, much better. Every time I go to Kosovo, I look at those beautiful mountains and forests, and I can think of tourism, hard currency. I mean, it just cries out for normal economic development. I would hope that all the leading political forces in the country would eventually realize that this is the way the country is going to be. It's not going to be part of a greater Albania. It's going to be independent. It's going to have to live with the fact that it's a multi-ethnic country, as every other country in Europe is. There's no country in Europe that doesn't have an ethnic minority. They used to say Portugal didn't. Now people, the Cape Verdean people are a legitimate minority. You might say Iceland, but I mean every other country.
There's Greenlanders there as well. So.
Yeah, I mean every other country, every country in Europe is multi-ethnic and multi-religious in most cases. So this is the rule. People are going to have to understand now it's incumbent upon citizens of all the groups of the kind, that includes the Kosovo Serbs, ethnic Serbs, to be loyal citizens and take part in the government, in the democracy. I don't want this to sound like a Sunday school lecture. It's pretty obvious.
Well, it's just you mentioned Bosnia earlier on as a disappointment. The Vetevendosja argument is that this could turn Kosovo into another two-entity system. In other words, another failed state in the Balkans, if too much rights are given to this association.
I wouldn't call Bosnia and Herzegovina a failed state, number one. I mean, I think that's an exaggeration. But I don't. Then you draw up a situation where the municipal association in the north simply does not have the kind of autonomy that the Dayton Constitution granted to the Federation and to the Republika Srpska. I mean, you learn from other people's mistakes. In this case, the West's mistakes at the Dayton conference. I mean, hindsight's 20/20, Janusz. I mean, obviously they were ending a war. I don't want to badmouth. Of course, yeah. I don't want to badmouth what went on at Dayton, but it did create problems. But the answer I would give to Vetevendosja is very simple. Sure, there's a risk. There's also a risk that they may get hit by a meteor tomorrow morning. But the fact is, you can plan a constitution or a constitutional arrangement that avoids what are the perceived weaknesses of Dayton in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And also, the relationship is, the power relationship is nowhere close to that. I mean, we're talking about Bosnian Serbs making up 42% of the population. No, I'm not really sure what the newest figures were. Before the war, it was about 42%, but
yeah, it's about 30-something.
38% now, something like that. The Kosovo Serbs are nowhere close to that. I mean, it's not a good parallel.
So there's no danger of Kosovo becoming another Bosnia, basically. But doesn't Vetevendosja, even though you criticized it on various grounds, play an important role in terms of highlighting the corruption, the official corruption?
No, I said that, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if there should be, I'll repeat what I said a few minutes ago. Generally accepted wisdom in the Balkans is that there's systemic corruption in virtually every country. and the rumor mill goes wild talking about politician X, politician Y, politician Z being corrupt. My only plea is then, if these people are corrupt, indict them, and have independent courts judge whether or not they're corrupt or not. But don't let it dangle out there. It's poisonous for the atmosphere. It's poisonous for the democracy. If Veddosia can cite something more than just simple hearsay, well, fine. But the state prosecutor has to bring suit. And again, I'm not familiar with the details.
Yeah.
I can't say.
Well, there's also a problem with judicial reform and law enforcement and so forth.
Absolutely. But you have to start somewhere. I mean, there's always going to be structural challenges, especially in new countries and new democracies. It's absolutely true.
On the bigger picture, when will, if Serbia ever does, recognize Kosovo as an independent state? Yeah. Will that moment come, do you think?
Well, I think it'll come if all of the parts of the agreement are honored by both sides. It'll take clearly a great psychological change in Serbia for the mass of people to accept that. Let's be honest about that. And I think it'll take some courageous behavior by leading Serbian politicians. I can't tell you when that's going to happen, but the preconditions have to be fulfilled first, and on both sides. Do I think it will happen? Yes, I do. I think eventually Serbia will recognize Kosovo. They will have diplomatic relations. But then again, I'm an American and I'm an optimist.
Well, yeah, but presumably a condition of EU membership would be mutual recognition, because you cannot have a country coming into the EU that would block another country's potential entry in the future.
Sure.
So,
I mean, even to get into NATO, you have to have borders.
That's true too.
Border disputes settled, sure.
So, and both countries, well, Serbia doesn't aspire to enter NATO at the moment, but
they aspire. The elections coming up probably this spring will largely revolve in Serbia around whether or not Serbia will have a future in the EU. And of course, the Russians. That's another factor.
Well, that's something big subject I was going to come to.
Pushing back hard.
Sure.
And Serbia is going to have to make a choice. I was going to say a tough choice. Maybe tough psychologically, but rationally it shouldn't be tough.
But as an optimist, and I gather you are, you see both Serbia and Kosovo eventually in the European Union.
Well, yeah, that's a long time in coming. I mean, it'll be never as they say, a long time. I think I could see that. I think there's going to have to be tremendous amount of structural reform, especially in Kosovo, before that happens. But let's take one step at a time.
Sure.
I mean, I'll be happy to have mutual recognition.
Another major question that's been preoccupying international players, and we'll come back to the EU in a moment, is this IS question, the jihadist question. In other words, recruits coming from the Balkans and other European states to Iraq and Syria, and then some of them coming back in the danger of re-importing, if you like, some of these networks, some of these terrorist connections that would have an impact in the region. How do you see it? Have we in the West exaggerated the Balkans as some sort of breeding ground for international terrorism? One sometimes hears this by some pundits.
Well, to the extent that there probably are more jihadists coming from Western Europe than from the Balkans, I think the answer is yes, we've exaggerated it. But it's a question of percentages. What percentage of the indigenous Muslim population of the certain age cohort has gone off to fight? I don't know that anybody has really done that in detail. If they have, I don't know the answer. I know that in the Middle East, and even there's not necessarily a correlation with what kind of government it is, because Tunisia, of all places, apparently has the highest percentage of people who've gone off, and it's arguably the only real democracy in the area. So it's really tough to draw these connections. But I think in answer to your first question, yeah, I think it's been exaggerated. I don't think the Balkans are contributing nearly as much in terms of, I was going to say manpower, but there's some women involved too. people power in the jihadists as other parts of Europe are. And certainly you haven't had the massacres, the blowback, as you've had with returned jihadists in France, sure, in Belgium. I mean, really ugly stuff. And I have not seen that in the Balkans yet. Oh, there have been one or two cases, but I mean.
Yeah, so you wouldn't see it as a major factor of potential destabilization in the region, radical Islam, growth of radical Islam.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that there may be isolated political figures who'd like to turn their political parties more into Islamist kind of parties, but no, I don't see a danger of takeovers, anything like that.
So no prospect of a Balkan caliphate, as we keep hearing from some sensationalist sources.
No, I don't think that's not, no.
Okay. Let's turn now to one of our favorite subjects, Russia and Russian activities in the region. Through energy, through business connections, through propaganda, now even through NGOs and other forms of, let's say, other inroads in the region. Russia is pursuing an agenda in the Balkans. How would you, what are the objectives, would you say, Russian objectives in the region?
Well, I think they go back to overall objectives. And I think that, you know, in every country, an effective foreign policy must have intimate, organic links to domestic policy. That's true in the United States, it's true in the UK, it's true in Germany, it's true everywhere. It's even more true in Russia, I think. What I'm trying to say is domestic politics, in my opinion, is the real driver of Russian foreign policy. And I'm going to zero in on the Balkans in a minute. The simple fact is, President Putin's Russia is not a democracy as we know it in the West. There are euphemistic adjectives applied to it.
As soon as you have to qualify a democracy.
Exactly. Managed democracy, sovereign democracy. I mean, these are euphemisms for, pardon me?
Power vertical.
Power vertical, yeah. These are all ways of saying that it's not a real democracy. Mr. Putin, it's a very corrupt country. Mr. Putin and the people around him have enriched themselves, according to many, many reports. And he wants to hold on to power. And after the riots in the big cities in Russia in 2011, after an election was questionable at the margins, he still was probably still would have won the election, but it wasn't enough. The rollback of Russian democracy, which had showed a fair amount of promise, I would say, has been extreme. So what has happened? He, when it looked like Ukraine was slipping out of his orbit because Yanukovych was hugely corrupt and inefficient and was thrown out, Putin responded by attacking Crimea with his little green men, annexing it illegally, and then through proxies and regular Russian troops invading Luhansk and Donetsk in eastern Ukraine, the Donbass. So why has he done this? Well, he clearly himself is a great Russian nationalist. He said that the biggest tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union, the great Russian people, the whole mission. He doesn't think some of these countries really belong as independent, Ukraine being one of them. He wants Russia to regain its status as a superpower. And when the West responded with surprising unity to the illegal annexation of Crimea and the invasion of elsewhere in eastern Ukraine, responded with sanctions which were ridiculed by some in the West and have turned out to be quite successful. And that coupled with much more successful, and that coupled with the dramatic decline in the price of oil has really hit the Russian economy hard. So Putin's bargain that he had with the Russian people before, that you let me run things in an authoritarian way, and we'll largely with the hydrocarbon revenues, increase your standard of living. That's fallen flat. The standard of living is plummeted in Russia. And so what does he have to offer? He has to offer foreign victories. This is the old, diversion technique. And the foreign victories fits in very nicely anyway with his great Russian nationalism and his desire to get Russia back to equal footing in some way. It's a pipe dream, but with the United States. So, what does this mean for the Balkans? Well, it means the area, although most of the Balkans I would not consider to be Russia's quote-unquote near abroad, it's close enough. He wants to increase, at the very least, prevent the Balkans from, the parts of the Balkans that are not members of the Euro-Atlantic community from joining. So what happened a few years ago? When it looked like, when people awoke in the Kremlin one morning to realize that Montenegro, little Montenegro with 640,000 people, was actually reforming, and it looked like it might have a serious candidacy for NATO, what did they do? Well, they went in and asked, and that is a euphemism itself, Montenegro to give the Russians a lease on a port at Bar. Milo Djukanovic, the prime minister, essentially said, go take a hike. You've got to be kidding, we're not going to do that. And this is in spite of the fact that Montenegro has had historically very close relations with Russia. Montenegro's King Nikola had two daughters who married Russian princes. And the Russians were obviously, the Red Army was active throughout the former Yugoslavia in the Second World War. More recently, many Russians, newly wealthy Russians, have bought villas on the Adriatic coast of Montenegro. Mr. Deripaska has built this gigantic aluminum factory.
He bought it.
He bought it, you're right, yeah. And it's operating at about, what, 5% capacity or something? I don't know.
Well, he's been kicked out now. So.
Yeah, he can't come to the United States, but that's another story. The fact is they're very close relations, and the Montenegrins still said no. Serbia. When it looks like Serbia, as I said, is going to have an election, but Prime Minister Vučić clearly thinks Serbia's future lies with the European Union. So one of the first vice president of the Russian Federation, Dmitry Rogozin, a real hardliner, warned the Serbs that if they would go to the EU, they would suffer what happened at Cologne on New Year's Eve. The Russians subtlety is not their strong suit, as we say. So they're pushing very hard not to. They're clearly making nice noises to Greece. In a sense, that's even more important, because if Greece gets booted out of Schengen, and if there's a Grexit from the EU, you'll see the Russians going in there feet first.
Plus, if tensions between Russia and Turkey escalate, Greece is
absolutely true.
Military.
Absolutely true. Yeah. So the Russians want to. This is part of domestic politics projected onto the international scene. They want to achieve parity, something like they thought they used to have, and the Balkans are part of this.
Should Kosovo be worried? Is there any signs of Russian subversion in Albania and Kosovo?
I don't know, actually. I'm not aware of any, but
it's much more difficult, I think, for Russians to penetrate Albanian societies.
Well, it's much more difficult. I mean, we're not talking about Slavic brothers or cousins or whatever you want to call them. And,
any close historical connections.
Sure.
But, let's turn, because our time is always unfortunately limited, two more subjects I wanted to cover. EU, and then we'll finish with the American elections. EU problems. Will the EU muddle through? You mentioned Grexit, there's also Brexit, potential British exit.
And there's Catalonia.
There's Catalonia, there's potentially Scotland in future and other places. Plus, of course, the Euro crisis continues. The refugee crisis could recur again this summer. How do you see, will EU muddle through again, or are we going to witness some major problems here?
And there are a few more problems. You've listed the big ones, Janusz, but there's also the rise of right-wing populist parties, which means that something like 20 or 25% of the European EU Parliament deputies are anti-EU, not skeptical, they're anti-EU. And in many countries in the EU, right-wing parties are increasing dramatically in popularity. I mean, I can do the rundown, but we don't have time. Am I worried? Yeah, I am for the first time. I mean, look, the EU, like the United States, is not easy to deal with. It's frustrating. It can be churlish. It can be, it's very opaque. It's very hard to deal with, and it's hard to figure out what's going on in Brussels. There's the so-called democratic deficit everybody knows about. But until now, I've always thought, yeah, they're going to muddle through. But you've named the crises, and the fact is, on two of them, they were preventable. And it was sort of the EU has pushed, and sort of, in a good way, the triumph of the will. I mean, they basically felt they could defy the laws of gravity in two different ways. One, in 1999, with the launching of the euro, without creating a fiscal machinery. And I'm not a great international economist, but I never saw how that could work in the long run. And secondly, Schengen. How do you create a visa-free territory without having real control over your external borders? It's going to be very difficult. What worries me the most, perhaps, of all the things, flows out of the list, the taxonomy that you gave, is a real decline in enthusiasm for Europe, for the EU. We began this discussion talking about the Balkans 25 years ago. Let me go back 25 years ago to the European community. Maastricht, great idealism. You talked to young Europeans 25 years ago and it was palpable. Building a new Europe. I just came back from living for a year in Northern Europe and traveling widely in the rest of Europe, and I see precious little of that enthusiasm anymore. The sex appeal's gone out of the project. History is not linear, it could return. But right now, there's not much enthusiasm, and that means politicians are smart, they can sense the mood of the electorate, and when they're called upon to show, and here's one of the great European cliches, solidarity, when they're called upon to show solidarity by taking in refugees, for example, look what's happened. I mean, all over Central and Eastern European members of the EU, don't be silly. We're not, we're not going to do it. This is a power grab by Brussels. Then you have individuals stepping forward like Mr. Orban in Hungary, who is unambiguous. He's putting forth a model of illiberal democracy, going against the whole acquis and spirit of the EU. So if there's no willingness to show solidarity, then there's a real problem. Now, overnight, the EU and the UK announced preliminary agreement on giving David Cameron much of what he wants in terms of concessions, so that the UK can vote this spring, and they probably now will vote in the spring, about whether or not they should stay in the EU. I fervently hope that they decide to stay in the EU. It would be the best choice for the UK, it would be the best choice for the EU, and most importantly for me, it would be the best thing for the United States of America. Whether that happens, I'm not sure. What might happen, though, is that other large countries in the EU might now demand the same kind of concessions that Cameron apparently has gotten out of Mr. Tusk. So, I'm not a prophet. Am I willing to speculate? Sure, I'll speculate. I speculate that the UK will vote to stay in, and hence Scotland will stay in the UK. I think by the barest of margins, Catalonia will vote to stay in Spain. I'm perhaps a little bit less confident about that. I am not so certain about the Eurozone. It's very difficult. You have to be a real paragraph lawyer to figure out how a country can extricate itself from anything, from Schengen or the Eurozone. I'm less confident, I have to say, with great regret, about the reforms working in Greece. I fervently hope I'm proven wrong. And I'm even less optimistic about the refugee crisis. I think this is a long-term problem. It goes way, way beyond Syria. There in sub-Saharan Africa, there are millions of people there who are dissatisfied. And this is a world united in many ways, not the least of which is television. People see a better life. Sure. They know the risks and they're willing to take them. And the numbers are absolutely staggering. And we're going to have to come to grips with this. I don't know how. If I had an easy answer, I'd be going to Oslo to pick up my Peace Prize. But that to me is the most vexing of all, and it may be the one that is the one that hits hardest at the continuing.
Mike, last question.
Sure.
We've entered election season completely now, full throttle, if you like, with the Iowa caucus. Both presidential elections, and we shouldn't forget there's also congressional elections in November. Can you sort of outline for our viewers in Kosovo the two, let's say the front runners of the two major parties, how you view them, what their positions are, and beyond that, how this will affect U.S. relations with the region?
Well, sure. I mean, if you go by the results of the Iowa caucuses last night, the two front runners are Hillary Clinton on the Democrats and Ted Cruz on the Republicans. I'm not sure I would say that Cruz is necessarily the front runner. He finished 4 percentage points ahead of Trump and 5 percentage points ahead of Marco Rubio. So it was 28, 24, 23, I believe. Yeah. That's not much of a lead, and Iowa is a state where the Republican Party is dominated by evangelical Christians, which might be difficult in itself to explain to viewers in Kosovo. It's not at all clear to me that that Ted Cruz will do as well in New Hampshire or in some of the other states. But what kind of people are they? Well, Donald Trump is the ultimate outsider. He's never spent a day in any kind of government position. He's a multi-billionaire. He's brash. He's all style. I find him totally devoid of substance, essentially no substance. This is my own opinion, and you're asking for it.
Sure.
I think the answers that he has thrown forward to foreign policy challenges are laughable. Building a wall with Mexico and having the Mexicans pay for it. I mean, that's absurd. And all these bomb this, bomb that. Ted Cruz is...
As well as the love affair with Putin.
The love affair with Putin, yeah. That maybe is not so surprising. I mean, I think I don't want to play pop psychologist, but I do see certain similarities there. I think Cruz is trying to play the outsider, even though he has been in government a lot and he's an elected sitting U.S. senator. So it's very difficult for me to see how that makes him an outsider, but he's trying to play that role. And he is rude. I use the word advisedly. He's about as universally unpopular in the U.S. Senate as any senator I've ever seen up there. He goes his own way. He's an ideologue, extreme right wing. His ideas on foreign policy, such as they are equally absurd, I would say. He was going to carpet bomb Syria and not even thinking about the civilian casualties or targeting or whatever else. I mean, it's just amateur hour. So Marco Rubio is young, also a U.S. senator from Florida, comes from an immigrant background, Cuban-American. I will say the one saving grace of all this, and it might be interesting for viewers in Kosovo, is to see that Cruz and Rubio are both Hispanic Americans. They're both bilingual, bicultural. I don't know so much about Cruz, but certainly Rubio is. This has become, in amazingly rapid fashion, the norm in the United States. So, here you have, you had another, until recently, one of the leading candidates on the Republican side, Ben Carson, again, who's, I wanted to say, African American. We have Bernie Sanders, who's the neck and neck with Hillary Clinton, who's Jewish American. So we are a multi-religious, multi-racial, multi-ethnic country. Hillary Clinton has experience. New York Times called her probably the best qualified candidate in decades. She was Secretary of State. She was Senator from New York. She was First Lady of the United States. She's brilliant. She doesn't have the warmest, fuzziest personality. Doesn't relate to people nearly as well as her husband, former President Bill Clinton, did and does. But she's amazingly intelligent, amazingly well qualified, and we'll have to see what happens.
And she knows the Balkans pretty well.
She knows the Balkans very well. Yeah, absolutely. Now, of course, the non-candidate who knows the Balkans the best is Vice President Joe Biden, but for a variety of reasons, not the least the family tragedy. His son died. I might say Vice President Biden and I went to Kosovo in the winter of 2000 to visit his late son Bo when he was working as a lawyer for UNMIK. Unforgettable time. Joe Biden knows the Balkans really well, but he's not running.
Unfortunately. Mike Housel, on that note, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Jan.
I'm sure our viewers will enjoy the interview in Pristina.
Super.
You should come and visit us in Pristina one of these days.
Well, I'd like to, and I'll say hi to my friends in Pristina. I have several.
Okay. Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues both at VOA and at RTK. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Miro Pavshim.